This is Jed Distler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I've been looking at a back issue of International Piano from the days when the magazine was known as International Piano Quarterly. And this is one of the earliest issues. It's issue number 6. It was released in the winter of 1999. And this was a magazine that I wrote for at its inception. And then for many years, I was not a contributor. And then when Tim Parry took over the editorship a couple of years ago, I came back into the fold. But I've been looking at an article which contains the pick of 1998, the critics choose. And 12 critics were asked to do this. They were asked to select their favorite piano disc of 1998, plus to mention a recording that they would most like to see reissued. And the editor, Harriet Smith, said that this is almost an impossible task given the exceptional quality of so many of 1998's recent piano releases and reissues, but, well, someone has to do it. So 12 of us were asked to make these picks, and in alphabetical order, I'm going to read what the picks are, and we're going to see just how many reissue requests eventually came to pass, and also to look at the top picks to see if these releases have stood the test of time, and it looks like most of them pretty much have, although not all of them are still available. The first critic listed is yours truly, Jed Distler, and I mentioned several significant 1998 releases, such as Vanguard's reissue of the Percy Grainger Grieg Concerto from Aarhus, Denmark, which was a long suppressed disc, and then it eventually did come out on CD. I also mentioned Robert Help's recordings of the Roger Sessions sonatas, and I also mentioned Marc-Andre Hamelin's unprecedented cycle of the complete Mettner sonatas, which is still a reference version to this day. And I also mentioned the William Capell edition from BMG that contained that pianist's complete RCA Victor commercial recordings, and it also included a lot of unreleased material. That was a major release. But curiously, I mentioned for my favorite release from 1998, the Mozart sonatas recorded in the early 50s by Lily Krauss on the Discophile Francais label, and they were beautifully remastered on Music and Arts. And I always like these performances because they're very tough and angular, very different from the Apollonian and symmetrical Walter Gieseking performances of the same vintage. I guess I was just really smitten with the Mozart at the time, and I still think it's a wonderful cycle, but I'm not sure why I said that that was the best of the year in relation to the Capell and the Mettner, which I thought were much more important releases, and I think they are in retrospect. But for my request about what I wanted to see reissued, I made a big pitch for the recordings of music of J.S. Bach by pianist Lukas Foss from the 1950s that were released on American Decca. I talk about these recordings all the time. It's sort of like a bee in my bonnet, I guess. But these have never turned up on CD, and they include the Bach 3-part inventions and the first and the fifth keyboard concertos. Actually, Lukas Foss made several other recordings for American Decca as a pianist, the Hindemith Four Temperaments, and also his own second concerto. And in fact, last year, when I was talking about box sets that I wanted to see, didn't I mention that I wanted all of the Lukas Foss American Decca piano recordings all boxed up? I think I did. The next critic on this list is David Fanning. His top 1998 release was a disc on RCA by Yevgeny Kissin with the Beethoven Moonlight Sonata, the Franck Prelude, Chorale and Fugue, and the Brahms Paganini Variations. I think the Paganini Variations really has stood the test of time as a reference version. And for the historic choice for an item that has not yet appeared on CD, David Fanning picked Lazar Berman's 1963 stereo recording of the Liszt Transcendental Etudes. And indeed, they did eventually come out on Melodia on CD, and I reviewed that release for ClassicsToday.com, in fact. For his top 1998 choice, Michael Glover chose Volume 1 in the Melodia BMG series of discs devoted to performances from the International Tchaikovsky Competition, and this disc featured the 1962 co-winners Vladimir Ashkenazy and John Ogden. I can understand why, because these are all terrific performances. And for the historic choice not yet on CD, he asked for a collection of performances by the tragically short-lived pianist Terence Judd. And these had appeared on the Chandos label on LP, and he wanted to have a CD reissue. And indeed, Chandos did bring out 3 CDs of Terence Judd performances eventually. The next critic on this list is Charles Hopkins, the late Charles Hopkins, who was quite an erudite writer, and he knew so much, my goodness. He was also an exceptional pianist. His top choice was the reissue on the Marston label, encompassing the complete commercial recordings by the Liszt people Emil von Sauer. And for his historic choice, Charles Hopkins mentioned several possibilities for his historic choice, but the main pianist he mentioned on this list was Blanche Selva, who was the dedicatee of many works by Albéniz, and she was the one who gave the first performances of the 4 books of Iberia in consecutive years between 1906 and 1909. Now, eventually, Ward Marston brought out a disc of Blanche Selva recordings. I don't think it was her complete recordings, but there was a choice selection of 78s, including a very fine Bach Partita No. 1. The next critic on this list was another musician, and a really exceptional musician, Igor Kipness. And while he did mention the William Capell edition, his first choice also was that first volume of International Tchaikovsky Competition discs on Melodia BMG, the one including Vladimir Ashkenazy and John Ogden. And for his historic choice, he made a pitch for the later EMI Chopin recordings by Benno Moiseievich. Those were high on his list. And very soon after this article, when Philips brought out their Great Pianists of the 20th Century series, that did include the Moiseievich stereo Chopin recordings. He also wanted the Chopin 24 Preludes with Moiseievich, and those, of course, did come out on APR, and they came out on Naxos. The next critic on this list is Max Lopert, and his top choice for 1998 is interesting. It was a Schubert disc on the Erato label with pianist Till Fellner, including the A minor Sonata Deutsch number 784, 12 Greitzer Walzer D924, and the 6 Moments Musicaux. I've never heard this disc, and I don't think this was a disc that was very high on anyone's radar, and I doubt that it's easy to source now, but I'm going to look for it because I'm very curious now. And for the historic choice, Clifford Curzon, he talks about the failure of Decca to reissue on CD almost all of his mono LP performances. Eventually, there were a series of Clifford Curzon reissues in small boxes, and then eventually Decca did bring out their complete Clifford Curzon edition. So I'm glad that happened. Next, my friend and colleague Farhan Malik mentioned the William Capell edition for his first choice of 1998. And then for reissues, he talks about Benno Moiseiwicz and Leopold Godowsky and Raoul Kosciuszki wanting their complete recordings to come out. And eventually, Ward Marston did bring out a complete Leopold Godowsky edition and a complete Raoul Kosciuszki edition. But Alfred Grunfeld has not fared as well on CD since 1998. There was a reissue on the Opal label. Opal was a subsidiary of Pearl. And that really tided us over, but we have never had a complete and systematic Alfred Grunfeld reissue. He was one of the earliest born pianists to record, and he was very famous for his very fluffy and flashy salon arrangements and transcriptions, and I think that was the majority of what he recorded. But there is interesting other repertoire. Another good friend of mine, Donald Menildi, is the next critic on this list, and he just retired as the curator of the International Piano Archives at Maryland. And his two top choices, he cheated. He mentioned two top choices, and I guess that's okay. The William Capell edition, which doesn't come as a surprise, and also the Marc-Andre Hamelin recording on Hyperion of the complete Mettner sonatas. That's a very wise choice, obviously. And for reissues, he mentions a lot of different things. He talks about Benno Moiseiwicz, because at the time there was not a heck of a lot of Moiseiwicz on CD. He wanted to see the rest of Solomon's Beethoven sonatas reissued on CD. I think some of them had already been available on EMI, but eventually Testament brought out the whole series of them, I believe. And he asks for reissues of Shura Cherkassky's HMV LPs. We've had some of that material, but not all of that. In fact, on my recent box set wish list, I asked for a complete and systematic edition of all of Shura Cherkassky's HMV and EMI recordings, and I'd love to see that. And he also asked about Ernst von Dohnanyi's 1957 discs of his own solo piano works and the second concerto. The solo works came out on APR later on, and only just recently has the second concerto emerged on CD in the Adrian Boult stereo recordings box set from Warner. And he also asked for the best items from the extensive EMI legacy of John Ogden. And we did eventually get something in the EMI Icon series. I think we got a 17-disc set of John Ogden. I can't remember if it was 17, 18 CDs. Maybe it was more, but it was a pretty big release, and it had a lot of things that had never been on CD before, such as the Ronald Stevenson Passacaglia on DSCH. Bryce Morrison is next, and his top choice was a live Shura Cherkassky recital from the Salzburg Festival in 1968 that came out on Orfeo. That was a good choice, actually, because it's a very interesting recital. It has the Chopin Preludes, the Brahms F minor sonata, the Liszt E major Polonaise, and the sixth partita of Bach, a very beautiful performance, and also Richard Rodney Bennett's 5 etudes, which are not the easiest pieces in the world. And I remember I asked Richard about this, and he said, "Oh, yes, Shura just played them brilliantly and with great eccentricity." And for the historic choice, Bryce Morrison also mentioned a reissue of the Terence Judd recordings that Chandos had brought out. And of course, there were 3 Chandos CDs that came out of Terence Judd recordings, and I think Bryce annotated those, if I'm correct. My friend and colleague Peter J. Rabinowitz is the next critic on this list, and he picked, understandably so, the Marc-Andre Hamelin recording of the Mettner sonatas complete on Hyperion. He did mention the William Capell edition, of course, and he mentioned on the Marston label one of the complete Joseph Hoffman editions and one of the Ernst Levy editions. And for his historic choice of something that had not yet been available on CD, Peter Rabinowitz asked for the Sviatoslav Richter live Carnegie Hall recordings from his 1960 concerts that were issued on Columbia Masterworks, and these were only available on the catalog for a very brief time on LP. I had researched the origins of these recordings and all of the intrigue that went into bringing them out and issuing them and the whole aftermath of the series. I wrote an article all about this for International Classical Record Collector, and I had interviewed Schuyler Chapin, who was the A&R person at Columbia at the time, who was very involved with the Richter negotiations. Eventually, these did come out on CD, first on the Do-Re-Mi label, and these were all mastered from excellent vinyl copies. But then the whole series came out. I think they were completely remastered for the Sony BMG Complete Sviatoslav Richter RCA and Columbia Recordings edition, which I annotated. Michael Spring is the next critic on this list, and he now is the head of the APR label. And interestingly, his top choice for a 1998 release was an APR disc containing previously unpublished recordings of Nikolai Mettner playing his own music, recorded for Columbia in 1930 and 1931. And he also mentioned a disc of Hummel concerto recordings by Howard Shelley. Among the historic reissue choices that Michael Spring made for 1998 were the 2 sets of Chopin mazurkas recorded by Ryszard Bakst, that's Ryszard, and Bakst is spelled Bakst. If somebody can correct me with the pronunciation, I will be most appreciative. He recorded the Chopin mazurkas on 2 occasions. The first of these cycles came out on Westminster, and the second came out on Musa. And I've talked about these cycles before on this podcast. You can find the Westminster recordings uploaded on YouTube. Next, my friend Charles Timberell had a very interesting pick for his top 1998 release, which was a debut disc on the Harmonium Mundi label in their series Les Nouveaux Interprètes. And this was a disc featuring François-Frédéric Guy, or do you pronounce his last name Guy? It's G-U-Y. I think you say Guy. And this was a disc featuring Beethoven's Hammer Clavier Sonata, Opus 106, and the Sonata of Beethoven, Opus 109, in E major, Sonata number 30. These are wonderful performances, and I think they've held up very well. Now, this pianist did re-record all of the Beethoven sonatas in a complete cycle, and those are very fine performances too, but there's a freshness about these that I still like very much. He also did another Hammerklavier in the interim, which I've reviewed as well. And Charles Timberell mentioned 3 significant French pianists whose recordings he wanted to see reissued. One was Monique de la Brucholerie, and there have been some major reissue projects involving her. There was a 9-disc set with 1 DVD on Mellow Classic that came out, which I actually have not heard, but the repertoire is really quite impressive. It covers quite a lot of ground. And the Do Re Mi label has issued 2 double albums devoted to this pianist. He also asks for the pianist Henriette Faure. You spell her last name Faure. It's not pronounced Faure because there's no accent. Otherwise, you would call her Henriette Faure, but it's Henriette Faure. And he wanted to have her Ravel recordings reissued. They have been reissued on the Sakuraphon label in Japan, and that is not the easiest disc to source, although you can still find it. And for his final choice, Charles Timberell requested that Jacques Février's recordings of Debussy's solo piano works, which was more or less a complete cycle, would come out on CD. And they did eventually on the Accord label, and that was a reissue that was in print for about 5 seconds. Fortunately, I do have a copy of it, but it is not easy to source, and it might be interesting to have that available again. So there we have it. 12 critics for International Piano Quarterly back in 1998, picking their top choice releases for the year and picking items that they would like to see reissued. And out of all of these releases that were mentioned, it seemed that there was a consensus around the Mettner cycle on Hyperion with Marc-André Hamelin, which still stands as a reference. And about half of us mentioned the William Capell edition, because that was a major, major release, bringing all of these long unavailable recordings together under one roof. And the William Capell material is pretty much available now still, which is good. Anyway, I hope this was interesting for you. I thought it was interesting going back to 1998 to see what we all liked for piano discs of the year and what things that we wanted reissued, and to see what transpired in the reissue market and what of the major releases from 1998 have stood the test of time. This is Jed Distler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode.